All right, I'm going to say we have a quorum and get things kicked off here. I want to thank everybody for joining today. My name is Garrett Allen, Director of Product with West Telcom, and excited to have you all join us today to review the changes and updates with the UC version 5.6.0. And we're going to be doing that by walking through setting up a new system effectively from scratch as opposed to um, just doing a tour. So let me run you through a little bit of what we're doing. First, some background just to make sure we're all talking about the same thing. Um, with West Telcom, having acquired TIA, we're bringing in decades and decades of experience in providing uh, communication services and endpoints, in addition to the great capabilities and services that West Telcom already had. We continue to work together, continue to incorporate TIO as a premier product of West Telcom, and you'll see that more and more as we continue to be. We are West Telcom with this TIO solution. So despite sometimes where we might say, hey, this is TIO, this is West Telcom, we are all one, and we're very excited to continue working together. Most of you here already have likely seen this slide, so I'm not going to go into detail. But if you ever need a reminder of kind of our background, where we come from, how we deploy, always happy to go over that with you. We do strive always to be focused on designing, delivering, and supporting mission-critical solutions. So we want to make sure that we take reliability, we take capabilities as a front end, or as our watchword, as our goal, and make our decisions based around how we handle there. And that came into a lot of how we built out um, this new interface and these new systems we'll be talking about today. In terms of who's here, the primary partner or audience that we're building this for today is going to be our partners. We really value you, and we want to make sure we're giving you every bit of support we can. So that's going to be especially those that might be deploying on-premises TOUC systems or supporting on-premises TOUC systems. Um, we've completely removed the legacy interface, so we want to make sure that you know where all the tools are, know where all those capabilities are, um, and know how to take advantage of them, because in general, you'll find that they're easier and faster to use in this new system, in addition to um, being more modern and supportable on a wider range of devices. And then finally, this is also great if you just want to see a full feature review of the UC, as opposed to really be thinking about on-premises systems. So even if your main focus is going to be on selling hosted services, this can give you a lot of insight into how we do things, especially as we get into follow-on sessions in this series where we talk more about the power of provisioning and other capabilities to get things up to speed quickly. So we're going to be talking about an example configuration here of a new TOUC system, effectively one that's been out of the box and never deployed. As part of that, we're going to be reviewing the new screens that have been built. We'll be talking about some capabilities. And as we go through and as we build this out, we're going to take the time to actually talk about best practices as well, not just filling out forms and running through as quick as can, but we'll talk about why we set things that way and cases where you might want to set something somewhere else. So we're going to start with an overview of the admin. This is just going to be a walkthrough of what the new interfaces look like for those of you who haven't had a chance to see it yet. Then from there, we're going to talk a little bit about what our training scenario for this in the next couple sessions is going to look like, and we'll run through that the rest of the way. A couple notes, because we do have a large number of people on this call today. I'm going to ask that we keep questions for the end of the call, but if you do have a question that you want to make sure gets answered, feel free to throw it into the chat or to uh, raise your hand so we know that when we get to that point, that there's something we can address for you and help with you, rather than waiting until that point for us to ask. With that being said, let's go ahead and dive on in. So we're going to do an admin overview here. Give me just a moment to change my share. All right, and this is the system we'll be working on primarily today. This is one of our test and development systems, but it's built and maintained as if it was a UC Mini server, so should be very familiar to everything we're doing. As a reminder, in terms of capabilities, regardless of how we're deployed, you have the same sets of capabilities. It's just really about choices around networking and capacity in terms of number of users supported, storage, items like that. So for those of you who've seen versions in our 5.5 series but haven't seen the 5.6.0 yet, the biggest things you're going to see is that we've added a significant number of additional modules or components, major components within those modules. For example, system and tools are entirely new. The global settings previously was just tenants, licenses, administrators. We now have all our trunking controls and carrier controls through here as well. Continued to enhance capabilities inside of the reporting. Some usability and quality of life improvements inside of the dial plan. And then additional capability inside of users and devices to make provisioning faster and easier, as well as to make managing your users who aren't yet assigned to an extension easier. Just going to go through and do a very brief tour of all those screens before we dive in to actually take a look at what those systems look like. The system module is one that's important to know, but it's generally a set once and leave it for most of your deployments. So this is going to be, how am I on the network? How am I making sure I have the correct time? How am I verifying my identity? How am I controlling access to my system through the firewall, through the intrusion prevention? How am I sending out notifications? If I'm clustered, how is that being managed and what's the status of it? And then how do we handle configurations with devices that are going to be supported by this platform? Again, we'll go through most of these screens as we go through the rest of this session. The big thing I want to call out, though, especially for those of you who are familiar with the legacy interface, is how we've broken out more of those elements. Most notably, time and notifications were previously subset of the network screen. And that meant it took a lot more, or it was more likely to need to be performed after hours for what should be a relatively basic change. Now, when it comes to things like time changes or email notification changes, that can all be done in most cases safely during the day. So makes it a lot easier to be responsive and flexible for your customers or yourself. And we want to make sure we continue to break things out like that. Every screen's designed to have a smaller set of features as opposed to what we're doing with the previous legacy interface, where it was how much can we fit on a single screen. So there's a few more places to go, but each place is a lot easier to understand, a lot easier to use, and a lot faster to work with. The tools screen as well comes into play, where we have capabilities for backups, both locally that you can be downloaded later, as well as that can be pushed out right now to an FTP server. If you're doing on-prem deployments, you have full access to system logging. And we continue to make sure that anything that our support teams are going to need, or anything that we would look at ourselves, is going to be available for you as well. We want to make sure that we give you those capabilities if necessary. Most of the time, though, this is going to be something where you'll be working with our support team and we'll say, hey, can you grab this log for us if we don't have direct access to your system? We can always go through logs later, and we'll likely have another session just on logging in the future, because there's so much that can be learned there if we really want to get into it. And then we've refreshed the previous tool screen to give us more capabilities in our diagnostics. The most notable thing here is that for our packet captures, we'll now stack up any and all that are captured during a session. So I'm just going to do a couple here. So we ran it. So if you want to do a few traces at once and capture those all before you download and manage everything, significantly easier to do. Makes it a lot easier to capture small bits of behavior without having to download and wait for a download to complete every time. One of the things I want to note about both the system and the tools is that these screens, it matters what system you connect to if you're clustered. Everything else from global through the users and devices is shared between all systems in a cluster. However, the system elements, because you control things such as how it exists on the network, and the tools, because you're accessing local resources such as logs or those diagnostic capabilities, you need to be aware of what system you've connected to. So That comes into play if we're working with clustered systems. So if you've got a server A and a server B, and you try to diagnose an issue on server A where there might be intermittent network connectivity concerns, for example, you want to make sure you're grabbing your packet capture or your logs off of server A. Happy to go into more details on that, and we'll continue to build out our support resources around that as well. Everything else, though, like I said, is fully clustered. It doesn't matter what system you're coming through. On the trunking side here, we added support for all the capabilities were previously, so SIP, PRI, and analog lines. We're going to focus on just PRI or just SIP today, because I don't have an interface card in this demo system, and that's also what we see most commonly deployed. We'll talk about how that's been reorganized as we run through and build a new one, but the thing I want to stress for you is that it's going to be a significantly more streamlined interface, easier to read, easier to understand what it's doing, and easier to share profiles between each other. We've added the ability to manage carriers with additional options for how we manage that and better visibility. On the reporting side, we continue to enhance things here, where we've completely reworked our detailed call reports, making that significantly easier to use and faster to work with, as well as enhancements to things like our user status view and active calls view. The dial plan, like I said, we haven't added a lot of capabilities with 560 because that was the most feature complete module previously. But there are some significant quality of life improvements, especially as you work through things like your emergency alerting, music on hold. The one thing that has been added is a very small section. It's just an option that makes it easier to manage your operator if you're using a global operator rather than personal operators for users. And then finally, under users and devices, the big thing we've added has been this unassigned user search. Now, this is a new system. We don't really have any unassigned users to work with at this point. But as we go through and you'll see it, makes it a lot easier to work with those users. And we've built a enhanced search to make it even easier to work with, even in a larger system where you might have dozens or hundreds or thousands of records here. We're going to keep moving at a pretty quick pace here. Again, I want to make sure we have a chance to cover everything we're going to do today. Our goal, as part of our training scenario over this in the next couple sessions, is going to be we're building up a UC mini server supporting 25 users. This system is going to be installed at the customer's primary location. So it's going to be on the local network for some, if not all, of their phones. But we do need to support both internal and external users, and that will be connecting to the PSTN via West Telecom SIP trunks. A couple notes before we dive in. This system's already been licensed. We're not going to talk about how we handle licensing today. We'll always make sure when a system ships that it ships licensed for you. So we'll touch a little bit on how that comes into a tenant, especially if you're doing anything other than using the default single tenant configuration. And then we'll also touch on network, but we're not going to be doing a network save today. As a reminder, if you are placing an order for a UC server from us, as long as we have the information before you need it shipped, we are more than happy to pre-configure it with your desired network settings. So I want to call those out because we're going to talk about those screens, but we're not going to be actually taking actions here. So we're going to dive right on in. We've got a lot to cover, and I want to make sure we leave time for Q&A. All right. So we're going to come back here, and we're going to work our way through the system menu first. So system, again, this is one of those screens where it's important, one of those modules where it's important to know which system you're working on. And I generally would recommend explicitly selecting the system as opposed to using, say, an A record that goes to any system, any UC system in a cluster. Most of this work we're going to do is something that, like I said at the review portion, um, we want to do up front. And it's something that, unless there's a change to a customer's network or they need new capabilities or something like that, generally once it's set, this is something we're not going to spend a lot of time on. Um, so we want to make sure we get it right the first time and then leave it as is. So it's important to know how to work it, but it's not something that, we don't expect you going in and changing IPs on a daily basis or anything like that. As I said, we've pre-configured this with static network values. My personal recommendation about a best practice is to always prefer static IP as opposed to DHCPs um, for any server. That being said, in some cases, if DHCP is an absolute requirement, we can, of course, support that. That is our default that we ship with out of the box, is with DHCP enabled. Um, but if that's going to be set and used in production, um, I would stress how important it is to make sure that the DHCP server has an appropriate reservation. Um, I would still personally lean for a static IP, even in the case of a DHCP server with a reservation for your UC system, uh, primarily because if the DHCP server ever gets reset or replaced, you don't want to run the risk of temporarily uh, missing that reservation and impacting phone service with a change to other network elements. This is going to be very similar to, in concept, to what we did with the legacy interface, but the big thing is it's much more stripped down. So we've got your host name that's going to be required. We've got your IP values for how you're sitting with your primary network interface. To make it a little easier for tracking things down, we also now include your MAC address directly in here as well, a little easier to find and work with. Uh, we've also added some additional validation. So one of the things that we're doing now is we're making sure that you've got relatively sane values for your IP, your mask, and your default gateway. So in this particular case, if I was to change my mask so that it didn't overlap with the gateway, it'll actually catch that and in most cases prevent saving. Not to say go in and just throw things in there and we'll catch you every time, but we've added more validation protection to do our best to make sure that we're giving you a sanity check whenever something's being saved. Um, the other thing you'll notice is our static routing has been updated. One thing that I want to make sure you're aware of when it comes to static routes is on older systems, you'd always see these populated. We've changed that because it was previously reading through and displaying not just the static values, but what was also auto-generated based on your network settings. Going forward, this is really only going to be your true static routes. Most systems are going to be like what you see here, which is uh, you're not going to need a static route. But if you do need to put it on here, it's your IP, mask, and gateway to use. Of course, just like with the old system, if I save on the network screen, this will restart network interfaces. So this is not something that should be done during a normal business hours once you're in production, because you will impact service, and we want to make sure we avoid that wherever possible. And like I said, we're not going to save today simply because we want to leave that as is, but always happy to go more into networking if you ever have questions about that. Related to time, we've updated this, made it easier to use, and by breaking it out, made it possible to change at will. A couple things to note on here is you'll always get the current server time through here. You've got your same access to different time zones, same NTP capabilities. The biggest change when it comes to NTP is it's now easier and more apparent that you can provide a prioritized list. The first one in your list here is going to be the preferred NTP server. So it will, if you've got 3 in the list like we do here, your preferred NTP server will be the one that the system attempts to sync through unless your other 2 override it. So still a way to catch it there, but gives us some additional protection. Again, this is safe now to do during the day, The only reason you might choose to not do this during the day and prefer instead to wait for after hours is if you're changing time zone or something else that uh, could change your system time significantly. It might cause logs temporarily to look a little odd because you might have your timestamps update in an order you wouldn't expect. So outside of that, um, completely safe to do during the day. And as long as you're aware that by changing what your server time is, you're going to change how those logs appear, uh, completely safe to do during the day. One of the things we want to talk about as well is certificates. We want to make sure we always have a certificate built for the UC system. Does a couple things. First of all, it'll make sure that we can properly have an HTTPS connection. And secondly, it makes sure that for devices that are configured with TLS, we have a certificate that we trust that's handed back and forth. This particular system is using a self-signed cert because we've been making some changes and working through it here. And we can come down and we can actually see the certificate changed, which is a short one because it is self-signed. So it's signed for itself with its root, and here's its public. We can, in addition to a self-signed cert, upload a CA provided cert. This would be our recommendation where possible, whether that's a wildcard cert for the customer's domain or whether there's a custom one built in here. Either can work, but it is wherever possible, being able to use a trusted CA issued cert is going to give you the best security and capabilities because you'll be automatically trusted by your browsers and devices as opposed to needing to come in and trust something. That being said, because this is a test system, we're going to go ahead and start with a self-signed cert. I'm going to run through the process of what that looks like, but I'm going to leave the one we have in place here right now. So to create one, we just run through and fill out these forms. You'll see this change over the next few iterations as we continue to make this easier to use, but it works as is today. So I'm going to go ahead, and this is tom99.westelcom.net. And then we're going to go ahead and say, let's generate it for 5 years here. When I hit create, we're going to actually on the back end create a new self-signed certificate, give us a chance to review it. And if we approve it, we can go ahead and install it here. In the interest of time, because this does kick us out and make us go back in, I'm not going to install this today, but that is the only thing that's required. Do keep in mind that if you change your certificates, you may impact service because you're going to be impacting anything that's over a TLS or HTTPS connection when the certificate changes during that point. So this is one of those ones we would recommend doing outside of normal business hours where possible. It's a quick process, usually takes less than 5 minutes, including setting everything up, but still best to do after hours. So at this point, we've got the system on the network. We make sure we have the correct time. We've got certificates on here. Now we're going to go through and do the firewall. In most cases, this firewall is safe to leave on by default because we automatically know what is supported in the system and what's used based on a configuration. So we can see how that's set. We can see what's being allowed through, and everything else is blocked. We ship it with the firewall disabled by default, not because we recommend that for production, but because we want to make sure during that initial deployment, if you run into anything, it's a little easier to get into it. I always make sure before we go live, though, your firewall is active, so we explicitly only trust the ports below. Diagnostic port here, really this is just SSH behind the scenes. So it's whether you support SSH or not. We generally recommend leaving that on in case we need to get into the backend for you, but that is configurable here if your customers or yourselves have a desire to keep that turned off to lock things down. And then finally, we can add custom ports. Most of the time, and I'd say 9 out of 10 installations, there really isn't a need for a custom port, but every once in a while it comes into play. So we can support custom port ranges, either a single value or a full range, and both TCP and UDP. I'm going to go ahead and save here to turn on the firewall. One thing to note is in most cases, the firewall can be updated on the fly, and you don't have any concerns about impacting service unless you do something that would block a port that's currently in use. But because we keep those automatically open, that's generally not going to be a concern. Next up is our intrusion prevention. In terms of capabilities, in terms of functionality, it's very similar to the previous interface, just a little faster to get through, loads a little faster, things like that. We still have our whitelist and blacklist, or our allowed list and deny list. Your allowed list here can either be an individual IP or a CIDR notation, as we've got in this case. It's going to bypass any of our automatic banning behavior. It doesn't mean we'll inherently trust a device without authentication, but it does mean we're not going to do any IP bans as long as something's on the whitelist. As a best practice, I usually like to make sure that any IPs that we are known and static that are going to be connecting in here are whitelisted. So we talked about how this system's going to be supporting both internal and external users. If some of those external users were at a secondary office location with a static IP, we'd recommend, for example, putting that in here in the whitelist so that we could protect against authentication issues or other elements impacting operations for other users at that same site. And then the blacklist is what you'd expect. If you put in your IP CIDR, or in some cases a DNS name, and then a note about why it's being blocked, we will explicitly drop any and all traffic that comes from that source. This is checked first. So if you put something in the blacklist that's also in the whitelist, your blacklist is going to take priority. So make sure you don't put your local network in there, or you're going to have some trouble. We'll just leave it at that. But generally, this is something where if you see traffic you need to make sure it doesn't come in, you can come through and do this here. One thing I'd note and one thing I'd recommend is, we've got a built-in firewall, we've got built-in intrusion prevention and all of that. But just because we have this doesn't mean that we shouldn't have a defense in depth. So we'd always recommend, where possible, making sure this is deployed behind a security appliance or firewall and not just left hanging on the public internet. Because we want to make sure that you've got those dedicated devices that can catch malicious behavior before it reaches the system. We've got a pretty good track record with the UC about it being able to handle intrusion attempts, but it's still something that we don't want to have the system have to spend cycles on. We want to have it focused on handling your communications traffic. Moving down to notifications. Right now, notifications is just about email, but we want to make sure, just to share with everyone, we want to make sure that we're leaving capabilities to expand that in the future, which is why we've renamed that to notifications. By default, and you'll have seen this previously, the systems ship with a basic send mail configuration running on the system, and then we'll attempt to use that directly. These days, especially if you're deploying on premises, that is not going to be sufficient to ensure deliverability because of additional spam filtering and protection rules without setting up MX records and all of that. So more and more often, we recommend using an external mail server for this case. With 5.6.0, we've completely updated the backend mail library, so it's faster and easier to work with, as well as gives us better logging, and have capabilities such as start TLS enabled by default. So whether you're running your own Exchange server or other mail server, or your customers running their own mail server, or you're using a service like Gmail or MS365 or any of those big providers, the system should be able to connect through and send mail from here. We only send mail. We don't actually have a capability to retrieve. That's intentionally not built in there. So it's going to be a no reply style email, but it is through here. And then finally, you got your test email. We've made this a little easier to use, again, by having it outside of the network itself. We've got that here. Now, I'm in my environment, so it's trusted, it's coming through. But again, I would, in most cases, when I'm doing an on-premises deployment, I would make sure I consider email up front and determine where we want to send that through and what service a customer may already have or we want to offer to support that. We're going to be running this as a single server for this particular implementation. Generally, if you see smaller systems, in this case, we're targeting a 25 user system, you're not going to see a multi-server cluster for that size, just because the overhead to install that is usually better spent in making sure that you have network redundancy or validating other elements to provide that better uptime. Absolutely possible, absolutely doable, but generally something of this size, you're going to see it as a single server. So when we come into the cluster, we're still going to see information on the system. We see it as a single server. If we dive into it, we can see our services, see those capabilities, very similar to the old interface, but a little easier to read because we took a little more space and a little more room to lay it out here. And then finally, SIP media. SIP media controls how we interact with any device that's coming in through what we call the internal profile. So anything that's trusted as an endpoint as opposed to a trunk or a peer. We've done a few things on here that update and change what has been done previously. The biggest one is going to be, especially if you're coming from our older interfaces, is we've moved quality of service out of the network and into the SIP and media screen, because that's what it's controlling. It's controlling what do I use for voice packets, what do I use for SIP signaling, and if we're doing video, what we use for that. This is both what the UC system itself will tag, as well as what supported devices will be configured to tag as well. So we change it in one place, it feeds through to all your devices and runs through everything here. That being said, I'm going to do a quick refresher on the rest of these elements, and we will keep this going. So we've got our transport. This is going to be what ports am I listening on, how am I connecting through. So we've got 5061, 5062 is what I've built right now. These are non-standard ports. Generally, you'd see that as 5060 and 5061. I was testing yesterday, wanted to make sure I'm making changes as we go. One note, and for those of you who haven't turned up a system on premises before, is that we distinguish between an internal and an external port that we listen on. So if we're working with a SIP trunk provider, for example, that requires that we be on port 5060, we'll often come through and as part of the initial deployment, make sure that we're using an alternate port, such as 5080 as our primary port for devices. Because we're auto-configuring things, and we can use templates to set that up. It gives us protection, and we don't have to worry about manually configuring that on phones, and gives us some flexibility when it comes to those other elements. Under the device settings, these are common elements that get pushed down again to supported devices, just like QoS. So you've got your default SIP password. If you're following best practices and randomizing your SIP passwords with a template, this will never come into play. But if a password's not explicitly set, this will be your default value for the system. Highly recommend that we just randomize passwords when we deploy a new set of phones or a new set of extensions, and that this never comes into play. But we do have a fallback because we make sure that every single challenge is authenticated, whether it's an invite attempt or registration attempt or subscribe attempt. Any request that comes in from an endpoint, we require authentication. So we want to make sure there's always something there and not just a blank value. Registration expiry, BLS subscription expiry, those are going to be how long the phones are configured by default for. Both are set to an hour out of the box. You can lower those down significantly, down all the way to 60 seconds if desired. Some of that tweaking is really going to come into play based on customers' environment and what we're supporting in terms of external versus internal users. NAT traversal is two things. One, it's how the UC can go through NAT to work with external users. And two, it's how external users are recognized and appropriately handled so that we can apply the appropriate values to it. AutoNAT enables features such as UPnP for the UC to attempt to discover its public IP itself, and then as well as checking for capabilities of inbound devices. The AutoNAT type takes a look at what's coming in from um, signaling on a registration request or an invite request, compares it against either a local subnet. So in this case, this would be anything on the 10.10.63.0/24 network, and says, okay, if you're in my local network, I'm not going to even check if you're behind NAT or if we have to do anything here. Otherwise, we'll verify that. All private subnets say if I get an IP that comes in and is pointing me towards something within the RFC 1918 address space, I'm going to assume I can reach that directly. Otherwise, if I get something outside of one of those spaces, so outside of your 10 dot anything or your 172.16 to 172.32 or your 192.168, we'll check for NAT, we'll check for any renegotiation that needs to happen. And then finally, you have a private subnets against local, except local, which means that if you tell me you're in my local subnet, I'm going to be suspicious. But otherwise, if you're in that same address space, I'm going to assume I can talk to you directly. Most commonly, we ship with local subnet by default. In some cases where a customer has a large number of VLANs, all private subnets is commonly used. Generally, unless you're running a small server-only network with everything else coming externally, you're not going to need the private subnets except local, but there's a few cases where it comes into play. And then the other elements we have here is going to be your external SIP address and RTP address. These are going to be what we use to negotiate with external devices if we haven't automatically discovered what those IPs should be. So this is going to be your best practice would be, great, I'm installing this at the customer's main site. The customer's main site has a static IP of 1.2.3.4. So when negotiating traffic with external users, tell them to send to 1.2.3.4. And that's true for both signaling as well as for media. And then finally, down at the bottom here, we have our codecs, our both audio and video. We can come through and add additional ones on here. H.264 is going to give you the best compatibility, but we do support the older H.263 variants as well as Google's V8 variant for video, depending on your supported devices. And then for the audio codecs, of course, we've got G711 MuLaw for the widest compatibility, and then Silk and G722. We will recommend leaving Silk as the primary option. That's going to be best for devices that are going to be on less consistent connections, especially your mobile devices that might be on a cellular or Wi-Fi network or a desktop soft phone, whether that's on Windows or Mac, where you might be moving around, or again, you might be on Wi-Fi. Silk has a bunch of forward error corrections and other capabilities that provides a generally better quality. And we would, of course, always recommend a G711 MuLaw to make sure that there's a fallback, especially for third-party devices that may not support Silk or other codecs we're working with here. Depending on what's changed here, this can impact service. So whenever I touch the SIP media screens, I always take the assumption that we're going to do this outside of normal hours or outside of peak hours at least, because there will be a small interruption of service in most cases, depending on what's been changed. And so just always plan for that as a potential. Very quick, usually under 90 seconds, but do want to make sure we have it planned there. As I talked about on the network elements, we have added additional validation behind the scenes on here. So we're going to catch you with some of the most common errors in terms of formatting, or if I fudge a an extra period or something in the in an address, it's all going to come through there. But in general, we want to make sure that we're checking it, or that when we enter it in, we validate the information before we enter it in. All right, so we run through our network and our system level settings. Again, everything we just touched on here is specific to the individual server you worked on. I'm going to skip over tools because this is something we generally wouldn't be pulling at this point for a new system install. We'll likely come back to that at the end of our sessions, where we come through and make sure, okay, we've got the system built the way we want. Let's go ahead and back it up, make sure we have a copy there. Next up, we're going to run through and look at our global settings. Again, difference between global and system is global, as we're trying to imply with the name of that module, is shared across any systems in a cluster. So if you are clustered, you come through here. It doesn't matter which system you're accessing. It's exact same settings, exact same information, and gets replicated out. To start with, we're going to keep things relatively simple. This is a development machine, so I've gone ahead and given myself a few more licenses than we need for the scenario we're working with here. But like I said, we'll always make sure that when a system ships, it ships to you pre-licensed, so generally shouldn't have to do anything here. If you ever do need to add licenses, which we hope you do because your customers are being successful and growing and you're being successful and growing, we can either load those for you directly, or if we don't have access to a system, we'll send you the license file. You can come in here, click upload, and sort through. Once that's loaded, you'll see new values come through. I'm not going to actually upload a license at this point because we are already licensed here. And then you're able to apply those licenses as needed. Based on our description, we're a single tenant system. If we're licensed with no tenants, with a zero tenant license, you can only have one enabled tenant. By default, that's TO. And if you only have a single tenant, you don't have to think about the domain that much at all. Because in most cases, it'll automatically be assumed to be that and set appropriately. So if you are doing a single tenant on-premises system, places where we talk about logging in, you don't need to include the tenant. So you never need to include at TO or whatever a custom domain is you set for your customer. They can just use their login name or extension if they're logging into their user portal, and so on. The thing we would do as part of a system setup, though, is we'll come through and we'll make sure that we have those all set. Now, we were looking at 25 users, so we'll build that through here. And we'll make sure we've got some soft phones and mobile to support those other elements. One other thing to mention briefly on the tenant screen here is this is where we would generally recommend managing any administrators that you're giving to your clients. If you want to make sure that your customers can come in and manage their own dial plan, manage their own records, but you don't necessarily want them to all have access to network settings or any of these global settings because you don't want to, principle of least privilege, you want to make sure you're not providing more access or more capabilities than are necessary in order to help control what we're doing. We would come down here at the bottom and set up a subadmin. You can either build a new user directly through here and choose the level of access they have, or you can use an existing user if they're already loaded. I've preloaded a couple, so we've got Jane Doe and Bob Smith ready to go. Either way, you can work through here to provide that level of access. Of course, if your customer's savvy and you're comfortable with them working through and having access to the system and the global settings, nothing prevents you from coming in and making them a full admin and giving them either super admin privileges, which gets everything we see here, or lower down system level privileges, which keeps them out of the system but gives them some of the global settings in addition to reports and so on. With that being said, let's go ahead and move on to trunking. In the interest of time, we're going to keep this section relatively brief, but trunking, especially if you're working with trunks that we're not providing to you, can be a part where we really want to make sure we get it right. And it's part of the reason we've simplified how this interface works. So I've pre-built one to prep for this call. We're going to talk about that first, and then we'll build up a second one just to give you a feeling of how that works. So we broke this up into 4 sections. We've got a properties, an interface, gateway settings, and any header manipulation we need to do. We come through and edit here. You can see it's a significantly less dense, a significantly less overwhelming, in my opinion, screen compared to what you would have seen on the old interface. And a big part of the reason why is we've built out an actual sub area to manage your profiles independent of your gateways. We've done that for 2 reasons. One, a lot of the time, this is something that you can use your defaults for, and it's going to work as expected without needing to make any changes. And 2, by doing it this way, we make it clearer and easier to reuse and share them between various trunks. If you're going to set up 4 or 5 different SIP trunks, either for redundancy or for different capabilities, you're not required to have that many different open ports and that many different profiles, interface profiles you're working with. We can share those all off a single one. It makes it easier to manage, both from a UC administration side, also from a networking and security side by limiting ports that are open, keeps things cleaner, keeps things easier to use. I'll show you more about how that works when we go ahead and build a new one. Other elements that come into play, it's going to be the host server. Again, as I said, when you're in this global setting, it doesn't matter what system you're on to make these changes. If we were in a cluster, I could be on server A making changes on server B, and it will sync through. We can optionally select a carrier here. We only have a single trunk built at this point, and only a single carrier for it, so there's nothing else in the dropdown. We can also manage that all through the carrier screen we'll touch on in a minute or two here. Gateway is how we talk outbound to the trunk provider. In this case, we're going to our Plattsburgh SBC, and we'll provide appropriate credentials if you're working with us on SIP trunking for what proxy or what SIP server or SIP proxy, as well as what credentials to use for all those elements here. We deploy and support 2 methods of trunk configuration. What we're doing here is our standard for single tenant systems, which is going to be a basic registration. In this particular case, we're registering with a username of test123 to our Plattsburgh SBC, and then we've got credentials through here as well. We've got a default registration expiry of that same hour, but the system will accept anything that the trunk offers as long as it's lower than this value. So the longest it'll ever be would be 1 hour, but I can tell you, for example, connecting through here, you're going to see a connection of 60 seconds, and the system will automatically re-register itself every 60 seconds. This is also useful in environments where it might be deployed with on a network that doesn't have a static IP for its public IP. And that way we ensure that with registrations and frequently re-registering, we continue to maintain those connections through here. And headers is how we control what's sent to the outside, or how we send and manipulate some of the body of your SIP messaging for call setup. So how do we set your user types? We can explicitly set it here. We can feed it off that billing number situation. Do we want to set a from domain? If so, what do we want to set it to? We can control things in the contact header. Generally, this is something that if you're working with a trunk provider such as ourselves, we'll provide all that information for you. And then our support team can assist if you have questions for bringing up on a different environment. So we've run through what one looks like. Let's go ahead and I'll show you really quick how to build a new one. I'm going to go ahead and click add, and when we come in through here, we're going to select a host. In this case, we're single tenant, so we don't have or single server, so there's not a lot to select here. If we were clustered, we'd be able to select anything in this list. And then next, and this is where I was saying making the change to how we handle our interface profiles makes things easier, is now rather than the system automatically create a new profile for you and requiring you to come in and manually change it to share ports, you're given the option to either select an existing profile or to create a new one. In this particular case, we'll go ahead and create a new one just for an example. We'll pre-fill some of this information. So we already give it a name. We can control whether it's used for faxing or not. This profile here, if I go in and it's a new one, I can click configure, come through, and I can choose what ports I'm using. If I want to have it on a different port, I can configure whether we're supporting things like TLS. We're making it easier to manage, which of your network interfaces you're coming through on. Are we pinging any gateways that are associated with this profile with SIP options so that we can see what's up and what's responsive? Do we need to set external signaling or media addresses here? And what codec or codecs are we supporting? Generally, if you're doing deployments in North America, G711 MULA, and you're done when it comes to here. We can also, and this is less commonly needed, we can tweak timeout values. We can tweak how we handle RFC 2833 for DTMF events, and we can change how we handle our codec negotiations. But this is something that we tried very hard to make it you set one time and then can reuse as much as necessary, rather than having to revalidate those settings every time you come in and create a new connection to a trunk or a pardon me, we create a new connection to a trunk or modify an existing one. We want to make sure that we keep it easier and simpler for you. When it comes to setting up a gateway, we have two options for it. This is all that's necessary. You'll notice only the proxy is set as a required field. And that's because if we're doing IP-based routing, none of that else is necessarily required. If I was to enable outbound registration, however, I'd want to make sure that I set my username and password at the very least. We can optionally have a registrar, so we can have a different value we use for registration. We can override authentication realms if needed. Generally, a provider is going to let you know if something like that is needed. We don't need that on our trunking on here. And then we can control your from user type. This is important because some providers are going to expect this to be what provides the caller ID, and others are going to need this to be your username as set here, or you're always able to come in and set a custom value. Once you set those up the way you want, you can go ahead and hit save. In this particular case, it gives me a warning that it might disconnect active calls. It's safe because it's a new trunk I just set up, but it is a reminder to be careful. If you're making changes, you could bring things through. And then obviously I use a fictitious IP for this setup because I want to make sure we can keep moving through. And I can see my status right here. So I've got one that's registered, is ready to make and receive calls, and I've got another connection that right now is down. I'm not going to touch on PRI or analog today. If that's something that you need for a deployment, though, we're happy to go into more details or have another session like this to cover those. Interfaces are very similar, just a little more stripped down because so much more is handled at the physical layer. Finally, we take any trunks we have and we associate them with a carrier. A carrier can be as simple as what we have here, which is we have a single pattern and one or more assigned trunks to it. We're not doing any manipulation of the numbers sent out, so we're not adding a digit or to the front or end of the number, for example. Or it can be highly complex where we're putting in individual patterns or to really control what those rates are. Generally, if you're working with a trunk provider like West Telecom, you can keep it as simple as what we're working through here. If you were working with multiple providers and you had different providers gave you better pricing for certain types of calls, that's where we'd come in and take a much more in-depth look at how we're handling our patterns. And then we can set, does it start with a 011, for example, for international dialing? Does it start with a given area code, or what length is it? And then what value do we want to give it through here? So at this point, just to kind of recap what we've done, we've come through on the system. We've made sure it's on the network appropriately. It has the correct time. It's got a certificate built, so it's ready to handle communications over HTTPS and TLS. It's got its firewall enabled. We've made sure the local network is whitelisted so that we don't have to worry about IP bands as we get things set up. We discussed notifications, how to make sure that we're getting email through there. We discussed the clustering, and we took a look at how to configure the SIP media to handle connections with any endpoints. We then came through, made sure our tenant was appropriately licensed, and as a reminder, on a single tenant system, we still let you access a tenant because there's some nice tools you can have in here with things like reporting and admin controls, but it is not something you're doing heavy management of generally, unless you're modifying an admin or you get a new license and you want to reevaluate how things are set. You don't have to touch the screen too often. We touched on licensing, and we finished up by building a new SIP trunk and reviewing carriers. Coming up on our next session, we're going to dive into the dial plan. So we're going to do a basic dial plan session next time, and then follow that through with importing a list of users, working our way through user and device templates, and then provisioning people out. One of the things our goal is going to be in this next session is to show how efficiently, if we do a little bit of pre-work, we can get a dial plan set and ready to go. I know we went a couple minutes long here, so we're at our end. I really appreciate everybody joining today. If anyone does have questions, I'm happy to stay on and make those available and get those answered for you. Otherwise, again, I really appreciate you joining. I hope you all have a wonderful day. Look forward to talking to you next week.